Hey everybody, this is just a quick note before the show begins. My guest, Derek Mong, I'm spoiling my own introduction now. After we spoke, he wrote in because during our conversation, I had done one of the things Joanna likes least about me, which is stop someone in the middle of a sentence and ask him to define a term he's just used. I promise I'm not doing it to cause problems or trip people up, but usually just because I don't understand what the word means or the term means. So in this case, the term was bro culture, but he wrote in afterward with what I think is a pretty great definition. So in his note, he wrote, whatever one might think of the term bro culture, useful designation for an established issue or trendy think piece coinage, I'd probably describe it differently if given a second chance. Here is the second chance. He says, for instance, I generally associate the term with male exclusivity that thrives in professional settings. I'm thinking of tech bros who create a masculinist clique that slows or prevents female advancement. Share our tastes, our tasteless jokes, our backslapping dudishness, they implicitly say, or your career will stagnate. He then addresses a little bit of a conflation I may have made during our talk. He says that might get at the difference between male bonhomie, which you brought up, and bro culture. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but the word is bonhomie, male bonhomie, which comes from the French for good fellow. So maybe bonhomie is in itself male bonhomie. Well, at any rate, he goes on to say, bro culture is something that I see in all male settings like Wabash, and one that, without even realizing it, I've occasionally found myself participating in and then trying to self-correct. So that I think is a really good definition and distinction. And we now will do our best here at SLEERICKETS to make sure that we don't inadvertently exclude Alice with our dudishness or our terrible tastes. We will either bond over her terrible tastes or we will exclude her only intentionally. With that, let's get to the theme music that you'll now have to listen to before hearing Derek reintroduce. This was horribly planned. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Thank you all for listening. Thanks especially to those of you who have taken a moment sometime recently to recommend the show to a friend. That's the way word gets out, and it is one of many things for which I am grateful to you. Thanks also to everybody who subscribes to The Secret Show. It has been growing, and it's been lively on the Substack chat lately. I should mention that in addition to 3 extra episodes a month, one of the things you get with a Secret Show subscription is a little heads up about some of the upcoming guests, as well as the chance to ask some questions ahead of time, or as has recently happened, voice some objections. You can check all that out at sleerickets.substack.com. My guest this week is Derek Mong. He is a poet. He is an essayist. His most recent book is The Identity Thief. I will have links in the show notes to a bunch of his stuff. He came on today to talk with me about masculinity and poetry. I wasn't really sure what direction this conversation would take, but it ended up being a lot of fun. He has a few essays we talked about. We talked about video game poems, on which I am a proven expert. We talked about Bly. We talked about Whitman. We talked about toxic masculinity and all boys schools. And I think we got along very well, even though we didn't always agree, but it was pretty juicy. Like, I think this is one that both Alice and my dad might like, which is a little bit unusual. Among many other qualifications for the topic, Derek is a male poet living in deep red middle America, where he teaches at an all-male school and raises his male offspring. For my part, I have an unusually deep voice, so we're basically peers. I hope you will enjoy this conversation. It was quite long, and so the second part of it is going to go on the Secret Show feed very soon, along with the second and soon third parts of my conversation with Shane, which people have been really enjoying. All right, now let's get to my conversation with Derek Mong.
Our relationship to like long poetry in the 21st century is so very, I don't know, kind of like ill-defined, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think I remember even maybe like reading the Princeton Encyclopedia definition on it. If there is an entry, I could be like misstating this. And right, like it's not epic. Like almost nobody writes epic anymore.
Sure. Yeah.
It's like maybe T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is like one of our sort of like mental models. But like, I mean,
Right.
there's plenty of
Right.
poets
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
like sequences and book length works and things like that. So it's like all over the page, right? Like, it's like 5 pages
Yeah.
or it's like 50.
I remember being really excited to when I first started, because I'd read plenty of novels before, but when I first started reading novels by people I knew who were working on novels, it was mostly Brian's work. I remember being excited by this realization that there's a length of story after which you can't hold the whole thing in your head.
Mm.
Like you can't even loosely hold the kind of the total, like there's a bend in the hallway and you can't see from one end to the other.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is exciting to think about as like a project you're working on, because it also means you can't plan it all quite. Like I remember my dad talking to me about the composition of the Sistine ceiling, and because of the way it was, because of the height and the kind of the proportions, he had to build this enormous scaffolding that went almost all the way up to the top, because it's fresco. You had to do it really quick,
Quick,
and so
yeah.
he's like lying on his back, paint and crumbs are dripping in his eyes. He's painting, he paints the whole half of it. Then he takes down all the scaffolding, and that's when he can, for the first time, see what he's painted.
Yeah.
And then he builds the second half, and he has to sort of rethink what he's doing.
That's a great metaphor for writing a long poem. I just finished a long one to my wife. It was kind of a birthday present. She just turned 50 and managed to have appendicitis on her 50th
Oh
birthday. We spent
no!
her 50th birthday in the emergency room. Everything's fine. She's great.
Yeah,
I
good.
mean,
Yeah,
great
right.
to the
Yeah,
extent that
but
like she
post
lost her,
appendix. Yeah,
yeah, lost her 50th birthday to having her appendix removed. But that metaphor that you're using of the Sistine Chapel, that like you're working on little small bits, and it's only when you kind of pull back that you realize like, oh shoot, like fuck this part of it up, and I have to like
yeah,
go
yeah,
back, and like you're constantly sort of doing a sort of zoom in and zoom out, zoom in and zoom out.
yeah.
It helps to like break it into little sections. At least that's how I've like almost all my long poems are in this each of the like sections of the poem is 8 lines with a lot of like space in between and just a lot of air in there.
Yeah.
And the sections are kind of like 2 quatrains with like
Well,
so
but
I can at least
yeah,
like work on bits and then pull back. And
yeah. Having like discrete, predictable units of length to work on does provide kind of a happy middle ground. I do wonder about like happily COVID has like taught us that rain check birthdays are totally okay. So you can just give her a new 50th birthday next year if you want.
yes,
Um,
exactly.
but I do like I have to say, like we're talking about masculinity today, but like that's some balls to give you, like, to do a long poem for your wife's birthday. Like that's like both like as a husband and as a poet. That's kind of calling your shot, and so yeah,
It
well
was not
done.
intended. I didn't start it as a birthday poem. Like, okay, I'll get myself in hot water in a matter of moments. I did not
It
start
was
it as a
originally
birthday
about
poem.
an ex-girlfriend.
That's right. I just changed the names, eye color, all that stuff.
Excellent.
Um, I started it as I was finishing another long poem to my son about, well, I'll set that aside. But I was finishing another long poem to my son, and then I decided like I'd never written one directly to my wife. Like we've been married a while.
Yeah.
And there's that like early phase of like getting to know your potential future spouse,
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
probably write a lot of, or I'll speak for myself, I wrote a lot of poems about her. And then there's like that long period of sort of like, oh, we've had kids and we're thinking about other things, and then it was
Yeah.
like coming back to her as a sort of subject matter while I was working on a poem about my son, realizing that like he'd been such a focus and a subject matter
Yeah.
for so long that it felt
Sure.
like a time for a pivot. And so I didn't start writing it as a 50th birthday present. It just took that long to finish, as is usual with like me and with poetry in
It
general.
started as a 45th birthday present. And yeah.
That's right. Yeah. I was gonna give it then. But it was a blazon, and I wanted to like sort of
Oh,
break
right.
that form, which is so misogynist and so complicated and steeped in male gaze. So I wanted to try to find some way to like recuperate that or question it or make jokes about it while writing it. So it adopts that form in some ways while also hopefully undercutting it. But who knows? I haven't published it. I mean, she's the only person who's read it. So
Help me. I mean, that's blazons are extraordinarily demanding, but help me with, because I am dumb about this stuff. The snows of yesteryear, the Beyond. That's is that what I'm thinking of for blazon? Is that the wrong form?
I'm trying to remember. I don't know that poem. It's the
The one about that's like notable women and
so the one that I sort of go to is I think I have this right, Shakespeare sonnet that is kind of almost sending up the blazon because it's already sort of
oh,
like
you know what? I'm thinking of a ballade. Never, I'm totally
okay.
yeah,
Oh yeah,
blazon.
yeah,
Of
yeah.
course, yeah. No, blazon.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, it's a Shakespeare 130. Of course, yeah. My mistress eyes are nothing like the sun.
No,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Good Lord,
Yeah.
boy, I am tired.
I hear you. I'm slightly jet lagged, but I think more or less sort of like recovered from it. I've been all over. So
Okay, yeah, no, the blazon. So numbering the woman's body parts, and if I remember the etymology is because it was likened to the elements of a heraldic crest,
exactly.
like the
Exactly.
different, if snow be white, well, then her breasts are done, and if
Yeah.
hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head.
So it's like history is just steeped in all sorts of things that are problematic and sort of, we want to sort of like contextualize or problematize or et cetera, which I don't know, for whatever reason, I was like, well, screw it. I'm going to like jump into this and try to do it without getting myself like in too much trouble. So I'm not sure I haven't gotten myself in too much trouble, but she liked it. So that was good. Yeah, we'll see. She's an interpreter and translator from Russian into English. And one of the projects we've done is to translate a Russian poet together.
Wow.
So there's like a moment at the end of the poem where I'm sort of saying like, well, like, and now come fill a page, right? So I'm hoping actually that when I publish it, I can get my wife's name's Anne Fisher, and I'm hoping she'll translate a Russian poem as a kind of coda to the project, so that because right, like the blazon is always about like female silence, right? Like the male sort of talking is a right a voicing over or a talking over of like the silent, beautiful female figure
Right.
off at the other end of the cafe or the what's that theater in England that Shakespeare's performing at the Globe.
The globe. Yeah. I do have I have a quiz. The male gaze came up in one of your essays, and I have a question about that, but we should provide a little bit more context. So we have a handful of loosely related things to talk about. You wrote an omnibus review of three books about the manliness of men. None of them by John Co-Ransom. So, Manly Health and Training to Teach the Science of a Sound and Beautiful Body by Walt Whitman, which was written a long time ago but only discovered relatively recently. Collected Poems by Robert Bly, and Late in the Empire of Men, which is a single poetry collection by Christopher Kempf. So you did a review of all these that sort of is also an essay about poetry and masculinity more broadly. And you also wrote a shorter piece about teaching Emily Dickinson at an all boys college. And then we have a few other things. But so apart from so you teach it. You want to say a word about where you teach?
Oh my gosh. It's hard to describe it in just a word. I mean, it is. So I teach at Wabash College, which is perhaps unlike any other place in the higher ed kind of galaxy. It is all male. There are two other colleges still on the American map that are like that: Hampton-Sydney in Virginia, and Morehouse, which is Martin Luther King's alma mater, which I believe is in Atlanta. Morehouse, though, has the distinction of at least having a sister college nearby, Spelman. Yeah, but Wabash and Hampton-Sydney, they're just kind of a bunch of guys planted down in the middle of rural counties with no other university nearby. We're a college of about 800, sometimes 850. Okay. The faculty is, men, women, the staff is men, women, but the student body is all guys. And, it was just like the hazards and happenstance of the academic job market that put me here. I had never thought about like masculinity until I arrived here. But like in the poetry world, I think the number one thing that people think about when they hear Wabash is Ezra Pound, who we kicked out in like 1908 or 1909, which he was fine with. Like he had referred to the town that like Wabash is in, Crawfordsville, is like one of the circles of hell. And like in the yearbook, he like won't look at the camera. He like takes his picture like sideways like this, which we still have. And like he would smoke in his office and all this other stuff. And one of the great ironies of this, like you probably have heard the story, is that like Pound was he was sheltering a young vaudeville performer one night in February of, I think it was like 1908, because Crawfordsville's right at this train junction, and this young woman had missed her train, and she was going to freeze outside. So Pound was like, "Here, come. You can take the bed. I'll sleep on the floor." And he promises his landlady like nothing untoward happened.
Sure. Yeah.
The best part here is that she was a male impersonator in her vaudeville performances, which is like he's like surrounded by dudes, and then he gets like a male impersonator.
Right, yeah.
And this, anyway, the landlady complains to the president of the college, and an investigation into his moral well-being is instituted, and he is found wanting, and they put him on like a sort of like academic leave. They continue to pay him, and he uses the money that they pay him for the semester to go to Europe and like basically start modernism. So like, I don't know why we aren't like more proud of this at Wabash. Right. Like it's this great shame, perhaps the most famous person ever associated with our tiny little, sausage party in Crawfordsville, Indiana. We send him off, and the money that we give him like basically founds modernism.
Yeah, you're the accidental patrons of modernism.
That should be like underneath the Wabash College, like that, right? Etched into like, stone.
I gotta ask though, you feel like she'd had a hard time. She was out of luck. She missed her train. She was out in the cold. It was tough. But also like you couldn't impersonate a man for just a little longer. Like you couldn't just sneak and just pretend you're just to get into the dorms. Just
right. Pound would have still had his job. Like, right. American poetry would have been entirely different if she had just impersonated.
Well, in that case, then she made the right choice. She fucked up his career for the good of us all.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So but it was teaching at Wabash that got you thinking necessarily about masculinity, because you're surrounded by men and young men. I mean, like particularly in this sort of this phase of transition, and whatever. I know you referred to a book about some myths surrounding testosterone, but like if testosterone has anything to do with masculinity, boy, it's raging in those doors. Like it's as powerful there as it is anywhere in a room full of teenage and early 20s men.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'm sort of like, I don't know how I sort of survive around all of it sometimes. And yet at other times, I'm sort of like, wow, there's a tenderness here among our students that is really surprising and beautiful. There's a kind of, obviously athletics are like huge. That's partly how the college is able to sustain itself, because we have lots of students who want to really still be very engaged in athletics. And they want to plug into like this Wabash alumni network, which you probably haven't heard beyond like Indiana or Illinois, but like within Indiana is like a mafia. Like
right. Yeah. No, that totally makes sense.
Yeah. But like if you look at our like, some of our admissions material, you see just like this like rah, like dudes on sidelines, shirts off, 12-degree weather, making themselves very loud.
Which seems like, I don't know. I mean, I wonder, like I have a lot of questions about masculinity, which is like, it's good we're talking about it. Like I wonder. Well, so you talk about in both of these essays a number of times the concept of toxic masculinity, and this is one I am really ambivalent about, and I guess I'm ambivalent about like the subject as well as the language. So do you want to give do you want to sort of pitch the idea or a take on it or a thought? What is it we're talking about when we use this phrase?
Yeah, no, it's a really good and perhaps more challenging question than it should be. I think when we think about toxic masculinity, particularly when we're like writing about it in the sort of general press, is men who are keen to suppress emotion, to read vulnerability as weakness as opposed to the opportunity to learn or grow, the disinterest in introspection, an inclination towards proving oneself through acts of physicality, potentially even acts of violence. Yeah, like the sense that a kind of men need to only be sort of like providers, that it surely dovetails with sort of elements of sort of like misogyny, that like women are right there as sort of sexualized objects for men, and that a sort of like kind of like broy, almost cliquish sort of group can form around a series of guys together, unaware of the effects of their own, how do I want to put this, sort of belief in centrality within the world. I don't know if that quite, does that sort of like help
Yeah, I mean,
a
so
little bit?
what you're with maybe one exception that I'll at least question a little bit. You're listing like mostly restrictive or harmful, or yeah, like limiting qualities or assumptions that are associated with masculinity broadly. I do wonder a little bit about like, I think it's one thing to say like, oh, men can only prove worth through physical feats. It's another to say like it's bad to prove your worth through physical feats. I
Yeah,
feel
absolutely.
like my wife and I got some furniture recently, and we unusually, she's extremely tall for one. We're both the same height. She's better educated than I am, smarter than I am, but generally more impressive than I am. And we were moving this thing into the house, and I got it up the stairs, and she sort of was able to kind of help a little bit. And she afterwards she said like, I can't believe how weak I am. I said, well, you're not weak. I have 70 pounds on you. Like I hope I can do something with that. like I should have some like ability to apply that somewhere. Which is not to say that all men are X or Y, but I do like. It seems like it's worth distinguishing between like some ways in which masculinity can express itself and beliefs that masculinity must express itself in some particular.
I think that's an important distinction, right? That like there's nothing inherently wrong with being a physical presence in the world, right? Like this Serena Williams has like an amazing physical presence in the world, right? Like that's like
Sure, yeah.
an amazing thing, right? Like it is the sort of to the exclusion of other things. It is to the expectation that other things are somehow make you more feminized or less male or less sort of fully within your own power, right? Like I mean, I think toxic masculinity is a sort of fear that anything that speaks of the feminine is within a sort of like male, cisgendered sort of male body or sort of person is worrisome or scary, right? Like, so historically, right, women have been marginalized, lesser, right? And for some men, I think when you see other men who take on what are perceived as traditionally feminine traits or traditionally feminine things, it's scary to some men, right? Because you see other people within your sort of like gender group giving up power, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things that is at the heart of like a sort of like toxic masculine, like a Ron DeSantis, right? Sort of like attack on trans kids, because particularly trans women, because these are like men in their mind who have
given up some advantage, I mean, this is the same reason that like the restriction, there's people notice when men dress as women, so to speak, but they don't tend to notice when women dress as men, except in very extreme cases, because men's clothing is normal clothing.
Exactly. Men's clothing is normal. Men's behavior is normalized. Men's power is perceived as the standard or the status quo. And if women are adopting elements of those masculinist traits, that we see that as progress, right? We see that as like the bumper sticker that says like girls can be tough, or right, like this is a tough woman who owns this truck. But there's no equivalent in our culture for a like a bumper sticker that has like a guy driving like I don't know, like what would be a feminized car, like a mini car maybe, right? Like it's not big and tough. And it's like, dudes can, use Fiats too or something. I don't know, right? Like I should say like
we got to work on the marketing. I'll get my brother-in-law to come up with a snappier slogan for that. Yeah.
I mean, I should say too, like I always feel a little out of my depth talking about this stuff because I came at it, like I was saying earlier, at this very weird angle, right? Like I came into this and thinking about this because I was suddenly surrounded by a bunch of guys and I was trying to teach them poetry and other things, right? Like I sort of, my charge is like American literature and poetry, and we're a small college, so I teach across a variety of like subject matters. And then I suddenly like was doing very rudimentary educating of myself about masculinity, mostly reading things like, you provided like from the Atlantic. So there are people who know way more than this. And I always sort of want to at least get a moment in there where I say like, like if I sound like foolish or, ill-educated to those of you in your audience who have like degrees in gender studies or, right, like even in masculinity studies, right? You're not wrong. Like I'm not an expert on this. In fact, one of the guys I replaced at Wabash has, written a book on it. Professor named Warren Rosenberg. So I'll consult with him. But yeah, so much of this has come from my own, like trying to sort of just like grapple with this strange experience of being on a campus that is so male and in classrooms teaching things that are so, I think at this point in our kind of like literary culture, often perceived as feminine or coded as feminine, right? Like I've been doing like these like little ad hoc surveys of colleagues at other colleges to see how many women are in their class, or at least, like cisgendered women, cisgendered men are in their creative writing classes. And they're dominated by women. So anyway, that's maybe a tangent.
Yeah. I mean, and I have some questions about maybe some of the ways, because you do, I think, as a lot of articles on this subject tend to, you cite some statistics that are true, and yet I think sometimes maybe misleading, in that I think there's something I would love to see someone do in a survey of male dominance of certain fields is control for age.
Yes.
Listening to a conversation Alice had with a poet the other day, I won't name his name, and he was fine, but like he was talking about his own experience as a poet, and he had his own theory and his own style and his own philosophy, and like that was all fine. But what I kept hearing was like, you are a white man born in 1955. Like that is what most defines what you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think, especially when we talk about like, oh, men run Fortune 500 companies, or men are in Senate, in the Senate, like true. But like a lot of those men are, even when they're not Ron DeSantis, they're Jerry Saltz at the New York Magazine saying, you know what, we need to hire fewer white men. I'm not going to retire, but we should hire more white. We should hire fewer white men.
I would love to see some of those studies. Like I was like preparing for this chat with you, I was like struck by like the opportunity to sort of like ask your listeners like to create or to like send in comments about like, because I'm sure you have many people who teach creative writing, and this is like deeply unscientific, right? At this point, as soon as I say it, it's like, but to like see like what is the gender breakdown of your creative writing classrooms, of your literature classrooms.
Yeah, I mean, I think college in general is dominated by women right now.
Exactly. And which is one of the things I realized when I started teaching at this college. And we're part of this consortium called the Great Lakes College Association, where universities like Denison, my alma mater, Kenyon College, Oberlin, Worcester College, sort of like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, a little bit of Pennsylvania universities all reside. And I remember going to an early sort of meeting, a sort of like UN of this like group of colleges. And we all provide these reports in terms of our like most recent admissions numbers, like what's the percentage of identifying men, identifying women in each incoming class. So these are all like small liberal arts colleges. And the numbers are like crazy. It's like 58, 59% women, like 42 maybe percent men. And I don't think that those numbers are that, I suspect that they are sort of like across other universities too. So yeah, like men, like there've been articles in like the Wall Street Journal, not that far away one, talking about how men are just not going to college these days.
Well, and you I think both identify, and maybe in a way that's very familiar to me, to some extent fall victim to this kind of paradox in talking about this subject, which is, I think like it's funny, like because Jonathan Farmer is a mutual friend, or he's a friend of ours in common. I think did you all go to grad school together? Is that right?
No, I met Jonathan through At Length. When he published one of my poems, we started hanging out, and he's just a delight.
Oh, and is it yet we can bracket this, but is it yet public knowledge that you're going to be taking that over?
I'm happy to say so. Yeah, my wife and I actually were going to take it over. We've been sort of, thank you. Yeah, we're very grateful to Jonathan. We've been very slow to get the ball rolling on it. Sure. I remember we were about to like talk to Jonathan about it, and I think like that was maybe the week my wife had her appendix out.
Okay.
It's just got a big translation project she's working on right now. But that's
he talked about that with me separately to all this, and so I know he's very excited for you to be doing that. It sounds like it'll be and having it live at a university or college seems like that'll be a good thing as well.
I hope so. We'll be able to draw on student
Yeah,
labor. That will be
yeah,
useful.
yeah. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so yeah, we'll to come a new a slightly new update or version of At Length with Derek Mong as editor. But no, what I was going to say is that I think a tendency Jonathan has that I have, and that I gather you have, the is one of anticipating objections, and
Yeah,
sometimes excessively anticipating objections. And I think
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
I have had people write in to say often they object as much to my preface or disclaimer as
That's
they do to
funny.
the actual thesis I'm trying to get around to.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, Jonathan certainly, I think, has this tendency. I'm often telling him like, well, just cut the part where you apologize ahead of time. And I did wonder, like, it was interesting in like in your essay on Whitman and Bly in particular, even more so than the Kempf book. You did a lot of work saying, here are all the ways in which this is a problem. Here are all the ways in which these guys get things wrong. Here are all the ways in which it would be either things to object to. But also, despite all of that, I find some value here. And it made me wonder almost like, what is the clearly like you mean all the things you say, but it almost made me wonder at times like, which is the motivating, like what is the thing that's actually driving you to write? Is it the disclaimer, or is it like, is this all like a complex package to enable you to say this maybe slightly risky thing, or what?
Oh, that's a great question. I really love that. Right? Like what draws you in it? Do you want to say the disclaimer, which is often like a criticism of the text or the author in question? In this case, Bly. There's lots to criticize about Bly.
Sure.
Whitman. There's certainly plenty to
Right.
criticize about Whitman.
Like his praise of bare fist boxing.
I love that. I mean, like part of
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
I love that book is that I feel like I can
Yeah.
read it. Maybe it's because of the distance. Maybe it's because of my own affection for Whitman. I can read it with a certain sort of tongue, like like I don't take it entirely seriously. Like I know
Right.
Whitman
Yeah.
maybe partly didn't either. Like he was writing it to make some cash.
Yeah. Yeah.
He didn't use his own name when he publishes it. He calls himself Moses Velser, which I just think is like a hilarious name that he
Yeah.
cobbles together from like a prophet and his mother's maiden
It
name.
really it couldn't sound more because it's like it's printed as Mose
Oh,
Velzer, so
that's right. Yes.
it's like it couldn't sound more like a fake name.
It's like, isn't Mose the character in The Office, the one who's like Dwight's brother? Okay, this is my
Oh, I think
son's
that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that's right. Yeah,
yeah. Who's played by one of the writers on the show and is always running away. Yeah, I mean, to get to your question, for me, I think it is the complicated package. I mean, I don't think I'm usually interested in just trying to say, like, provide some praise of these authors, but I have to like do huge prefaces to get there. But I share that sort of that sense that you're describing of like often needing to sort of like pre-apologize or contextualize the point. I mean, for me, they're both like, and I think that's one of the beauties of certainly writing a sort of long essay review. It's one of the beauties of reading literature is to like not just be able to fall easily into good, bad, like
yeah,
problematic, praiseworthy. I think it's one of the things that we've lost to some extent in the kind of world of poetry criticism. I'm gonna have like my own theories about this, but I feel like Twitter's at least partially to blame. That like we're not able to sort of like see that like Bly and Whitman have lots of things that make them sort of like certainly to a contemporary audience like cringy, but there's also something like quite beautiful in there. I want to have those two things coexist,
sure. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like, and that's like, I mean, that's partly
yeah.
like the teacher in me too. It's certainly the sort
Right.
of like graduate student. It's certainly the person who like in writing any sort of like thesis or argument wants to find the complications to not merely dismiss, right? And I have a line
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
essay about Whitman. I use it for Whitman, but it's probably applicable to everybody. And I'm quoting Linda
Oh,
Gregerson.
I just pulled that up. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The poet Linda Gregerson once said about Whitman, "We are all historical actors. Our own moral bearing will surely 100 years from now be found severely wanting." You say, that strikes me as spot on. There's much in manly health to celebrate. There's much to revile. In weighing one against the other, it's worth remembering that our grandchildren will do the same for us. Let us proceed sympathetically, not for Whitman's sake, but for our own. Which seems, I mean, it seems right. And it seems like when you say, like, well, you want the objectionable elements to be able to live alongside the praiseworthy elements. And it seems to me that that's sort of always the case. And the question really is like, if there is a wild imbalance, or if like the set of objectionable elements is more comes readier to hand at the moment.
I think. Oh, so is that the question? Like, which one comes more ready to hand? Like the
No. I mean,
objectionable.
I guess like I tend to see almost all writers in those terms, right? It's just that like in some cases the objectionable elements are way bigger than the praiseworthy elements.
Like
I mean, yeah, I mean, and in a few, but also like he has like serious praiseworthy elements, right? Like
Yeah.
it would be different if he were, I don't know, I'm trying to figure which contemporary poet to pick on. If he were Matthew Zapruder and an Italian fascist, I would say like, it's, I don't know.
I was at an MLA talk once where, gosh, I think it was David Kaplan, who is a scholar and poet at Ohio Wesleyan, was making this case against, I think I sort of say against, a poet for whom we often think as being sort of like social justice, politically sort of like as foreground as possible, Adrian Rich. And he was making the case that like Adrian Rich had these like passages, I won't be able to remember the poem title, which are quite disparaging of Orthodox Jews. And that was like his entire sort of like talk. He cited Ian McEwan as well.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's right. I mean, I guess all poets have both these elements. I guess maybe I just feel sometimes that like there's this, I don't know, I notice it, maybe it's just from like looking at social media, that there's this interest in simply finding the problems, and then that means I don't have to engage with that particular poet or that movement, right? It just makes it easier on me I'm speaking as a sort of like anonymous contemporary poet trying to sort of navigate the world of this vast historical corpus of Anglophone literature. Like, oh, there's that thing in Whitman that is like not, it makes me cringe. So now I can not have to really do much with that anymore. Or there's that thing in Bly. And that part for me is always suspect. Like I always find that and sad and just like
well, that's, I mean,
and maybe that goes without saying, but
true. Well, I mean, and that's the thing is like I feel like I'm also terrible at these things, and this is why I'm not invited to a lot of conferences. But like to me, like I would have my hand shot up in the air at that presentation on Adrian Rich having some retrograde views of Orthodox Jews. And my question would be like, no shit, man. Like of course there's something you can find. Like she's not my favorite poet, but like she had some writing worth contending with, and she was extremely progressive and like gave a lot of energy and time and care to making the world a better place in ways that she believed in. And like, did she also do and think some shitty things? Like fucking of course. Like did Abraham Lincoln also like tell some like crummy jokes from like I believe it. Like sure, great, and so what? Like I don't know.
I hear the crummy Abraham Lincoln jokes now.
He apparently, like, there was a thing that came out like 10 years ago that he apparently had like in his correspondence included some like racist jokes here and there, which seems like not good, but also like cool. Is that news? Like it's like I don't know. It's like
I just I went to AWP in what was it, March, because I was so close. Like I'm in Portland right now. I was in Seattle. I was like okay, fine. Despite all the reasons never to go to AWP again or whatever. And when I was attending panels, which I was doing in part to develop a class that I want to teach with a colleague, this opinion that what you and I are describing is that like there are, poets are all going to have some sort of problem in their past. Even Abraham Lincoln, not a poet, but a generally considered a very good human being. And we have to contend with the problems without just sort of throwing the baby out with the problem bathwater. I didn't get the impression that was a widely held view. In the panels that I was attending. Like it was much more like, attending a panel where we're talking about trying to sort of decolonialize the creative writing classroom, and we're holding up some text by David Foster Wallace where he's having an interaction with a student, and it's about the use of African-American vernacular English.
Sure.
And he's sort of saying, like, I'm paraphrasing Wallace, like, look, if you're using this sort of English in your everyday life, whether this is fair or not, whether this is right or not, you need to know that there are going to be consequences in terms of how you're perceived. And, Wallace is saying like, that's something you need to be aware of. And I should tell you as your teacher, right? Like he's not endorsing the sort of belief that this is, but this quote was held up in this particular panel as just like, oh, Wallace is, I mean, it's easy to make fun of David Foster Wallace because he's dead and he's a white guy and all this other stuff. And, I'm sure there's all sorts of genuinely objectionable things about this guy whose career I don't know.
But that's a version of like a talk a lot of parents have with a lot of kids about a lot of subjects, which is like like even like the way I think of it is like being a defensive driver, like being a defensive, like which doesn't mean like you're at fault. It just means that like other people aren't very good drivers sometimes. So like be aware.
Yeah. Yeah. I could see sort of objections to how Wallace was sort of framing this. I could see
Sure.
some of this, but the move in the room and both with the panelists was to just sort of like it was just criticized, right? Like
Yeah.
Wallace is now. I mean, it wasn't like he was getting canceled on stage,
Right.
but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I
But
didn't feel
yeah.
that sense of like balancing it out.
Yeah. And I guess like as with bad writing, bad behavior, especially bad behavior at a relatively low level, I feel like is just not like is that's dog bites man, right? The man bites dog is like, oh, you wrote a brilliant novel, or I mean, I don't even like love his novel, but like you wrote some brilliant short stories, you wrote a wonderful poem. Like what's remarkable is when people do things that stand out for their significance, or when they do something truly, truly atrocious. But I think most of us like mostly do shitty things and mostly write shitty poems, and occasionally something
Yeah.
stands out. Like this is like I remember reading Homer for the first time and being really shaken by this very different vision of admirable figures, because
Yeah.
the admirable figures I had been presented with throughout all of Catholic school were martyrs. These were
Mm.
people who were willing to profoundly deny their own body, were willing to abstain, were willing to not cry uncle, not allow themselves to be flayed alive or grilled, or whatever, done on the side, more weight, whatever it was. And it was through this sort of purity and negation and never
Mm.
giving in, and like
Yeah.
the Saint Lucia, or Lucia, however it's pronounced, who is praised for having like had her eyes cut out and been murdered rather than have sex with someone. You think like,
Yeah.
well, is that praiseworthy? Like, not sure that's advice I would give to anyone I cared about. Like, so it was amazing to me then reading Homer, where you have every character in there does something bad. Like every character
Yeah.
does something shitty, and
Yeah.
sometimes something like even like cowardly or turning tail and running, or like just
Yeah.
like, let's say we stabbed some guys in their sleep, cool, or whatever it was, or like take brutalizing a beggar or some horrible thing. But then what's notable is not that you always abstained or that you denied yourself or you negated something. What stands out is that you occasionally became godlike. You occasionally did something amazing. And to me, like that's what interests me among writers, is like the crumminess is the status quo. It's like the occasional
Yeah.
brilliance, one way or another, that's remarkable, particularly with the dead. Like,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
if you're
Yeah.
dead, it's like, sure, there's plenty to credit. I'm sure, like, I'm not surprised by crumminess that comes up in anybody's biography, but like, was there anything worth remembering?
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I mean, I'm guessing like a lot of the reasons we sort of focus on these things is, of course, to sort of balance out the historical sort of weight of marginalized voices and
Yeah,
all this
yeah.
other stuff.
But I don't think it's a very good way to do that. Like the way to do that is to find the marginalized voices to praise and to
Yeah,
talk about. Like find the examples
yeah,
of people doing amazing things who are not already canonical. Like that's because like I don't think that shitting on David Foster Wallace and like I have plenty to shit on him about. I have objections to his writing as well. But like I don't really think shitting on him makes anybody else's life better. Like I don't think it elevates
no,
anybody.
it
So
gets an
yeah,
applause line. I mean, it gets an
yeah,
applause line. It's sort of a group affirmation. And I mean, like, to like think back to this essay that I wrote, like I do genuinely believe that like Whitman and Bly have provided, lasting
yeah.
work to put into the world. And I'm like, I mean, particularly in Bly's case, I was sort of interested in how and it maybe doesn't take up a ton of the essay, but how the stuff we think of as being problematic in terms of his approach to men
Mhm.
influence at least the parts of his poetry that I find so amazing, which are the early deep imagist books like Silence in a Snowy Field.
Mhm.
And there's like a little paragraph in there where at least for me, I felt like that was like, it took me a while to probably come to that sort of like realization, but there's a connection, right? That there's a sort
Oh
of
yeah,
like
yeah.
trying to find, as Bly does in this kind of crazy book, Iron John, which you can still find in like little free libraries all across
Yeah,
the
I
country.
remember. I remember. Yeah, it being given as a gift a lot when I was a kid.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Particularly, like, I don't know when you grew up, but like, you know, if you're in the 90s, right, like it was really
Yeah, yeah,
popular.
yeah. I think I got a copy for some birthday.
And there's all these lines in there which are like, although Bly tries to say he's not like trying to, subjugate women and this is like apolitical,
Mhm.
there's sort of like an essentializing of like masculinity and femininity that is just part of
Yeah,
how Bly thinks of the world, right? Like he thinks of
yeah,
like these essences that make men and women who they are. And for me to connect that essence finding and all the problems that it creates to the essence finding in a poem like Old Boards, which I sort of quote in the piece, that felt like an interesting insight to me, that like what in a way doesn't work or creates problems in sort of like thinking about gender relations in the United States, actually that same move when you're like looking at some object in the world like boards in a farm
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yard create something really lasting and beautiful, that like
Yeah. Oh,
that yeah, okay, yeah,
that observation. So and I think if I remember correctly, the way you framed it was something like, what can be terrible in politics can be beautiful in poetry.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that seemed to me like to get it. One of the one of the things that made both like the question of masculinity in poetry a particularly interesting one, as well as what I think it helped me understand what sometimes troubles me about conversations about toxic masculinity is a conflation of the descriptive with the prescriptive.
say that again for me, sorry, I was looking for a
Yeah,
passage.
no, sorry. I think like saying things about what masculinity is essentially, or what it ought to be essentially,
Sure.
can be can it's hard. I won't say it can go wrong. It's hard to go right, you know.
Yes,
But
exactly.
but saying what it feels like, or saying what some experience is like, describing something in your own life or in a poem, is just, that's part of the human experience, good, bad, or otherwise. It's
Yeah.
part of what is happening, and I think that clarified to me also some of my ambivalence about toxic masculinity as a term and as a topic. That it seemed like you get at it because you say, you start your one of these essays by talking about, I think you start one by saying like, what can save us from toxic masculinity, and the other one by talking about like, well, men have all these advantages, and yet and the clear tension is between saying men or boys are having trouble and
Mhm.
saying men or boys are victims or are the victims, right? And
Yes,
so there is this sort of funny, like it is.
it's a little dance that one has to do, in
Yeah,
particularly in a post-Roe world where, right, the patriarchy seems to be totally on the rise and women are getting, forced to have children and all across the South, and not wanting to sort of, you're right, like it's what we're getting back to that point you're talking about earlier about like trying to sort of like pre defend myself against what I suspect will be like attacks, right, that
right,
like,
right. Oh yeah,
yeah,
but I think the move that you don't make, but it becomes often implied, and I think I see it everywhere. Is, I'm not saying men are victims. I'm saying they're in trouble, but then inevitably the implication becomes it's their fault. So if we were going to teach boys about this, let's teach them about this problem that it's their fault that they're doing. And so I think,
yeah,
which I know you're not intending, but I think that often is how this comes across. And so I think what occurred to me was, particularly when I was in high school, I think that things are a little bit, as you said, like there's no such thing as clear, straightforward progress, but things have changed in certain respects. And I know, like, even stuff my sister dealt with when she was my older daughter's age is different now, and is
yeah,
different here, in some better ways. But there was a lot of talk, particularly when I was in high school, about the pressure put on girls to look a certain way, and the way in which girls were made to think about their bodies, and that this was a real problem, and this led to damaging self-destructive behavior. This led to mental pain, physical pain. This was a problem, but I think it was not presented as, this is something that you have, or that you are. It was presented as, this is something that's been done to you.
yeah.
And I do wonder with toxic masculinity if there's a little bit too much of a conflation between, here's something about what you are, or what you do, or what you have, and here's something that you have inherited or that's been done to
Yes.
you. And again, that's where something like controlling for age, I think, can make a big
Mhm.
difference. right? Because it's like, well, yeah, go ahead, because you're the one who teaches boys.
Which doesn't mean I really have figured out anything about them. I think that's a great distinction, right? Like the distinction between what's been done to you, how you've grown up in this system that sort of prescribes certain behaviors that you should have as a young man, and then like the difference between that and then blaming young men. I think it's really easy to blame young men right now, to say that they are the problems, right? They're going up and shooting up schools. They're, catcalling women, they're raping, right? There's all sorts of things that they're doing. And I don't want to sort of, deny the problems and all of that and all of the ways in which free will is sort of, behind some of those choices. But there's a fucking system that is screwing them up. And it is the same system that was screwing women up for years and still screws them up. And it's right, the patriarchy. And they're being sort of raised in this sort of fucked up world where they have to act a certain way to get the approval of their fathers or the approval of their peer groups. And they don't even know that there's like a more expansive version of masculinity that's available to them. And I mean, some of this is like, you talk about the difference in ages. I think some of it also has to do with location and what you're exposed to, right? Like there's a reason I came to Portland for the year that I had away from West Central Indiana. And masculinity was like a big fucking part of it. Like I get in trouble with some of my colleagues about this, but like living in Crawfordsville, Indiana, a town of 15,000 that is like a 75%, 76% Trump voting county that has gotten worse, obviously, in the last 6 years because of Trump's sort of influence. And he has unleashed such a sort of like, floodgate of how you can be an asshole as a man. It was exhausting.
He's created new possibilities for masculinity.
Exactly. Such awful new depths that we can go to. It was exhausting to be a man who wasn't like that in that county, even with the sort of like very small bubble of my fellow faculty and things like that. Every time I went to a hardware store where masculinity is at its sort of like, one of its nucleuses or one of its sort of like, souls exists in the hardware store. There's this writer and thinker, Jared Sexton. He's on Twitter a lot too. He describes something called the man test that he often is said to have failed because he like goes like, he came to Wabash and he was describing an incident where like a tree fell in his yard and he had to like deal with it. So he like went over to his neighbor and be like, can I borrow like your chainsaw or like your axe or something? And the guy looked at him and was like, what? Like he could tell in the other guy's face that like, oh, you don't have a chainsaw, you don't have an axe, right? You've already failed one portion of the man test. Right. West Central Indiana is like a series of fucking men tests. And I was always failing, like, and like coming out to Portland, I'm surrounded by men who have a far more expansive version of masculinity, which is like how I like to think about the possibilities for it, like a flexible masculinity, an expansive masculinity, right? Like it's something that isn't like so narrow and prescriptive as you're saying, that then slots guys into a particular way. And I sort of feel like that hasn't opened up, right? Like there's that.
It certainly hasn't opened up the way it has for women.
No, for women, it is a sign of progress. But as that's happened for women, I feel like men have become narrower and narrower. At least cisgendered, white men in particular, right? That like so many of the guys I see feel a certain stigma around therapy, for instance. Like that would be a sort of like element of toxic masculinity I didn't mention earlier. That like mental health treatment is not something you do.
Yeah, is that limited to white men? Like, I don't know.
No, probably not.
I mean, my feeling with a lot of this is like I live acting like a relatively, what probably Alice would giddily describe as a feminist way. Raising two daughters, I'm the primary caregiver. My wife definitely makes a lot more money than me and is much more accomplished and impressive. I'm very supportive of her, supportive of my daughters. I'm constantly doing shit around that. Reading about my men or never do housework. I do chafe a little bit at that and like, well, fucking, I'm doing a lot of housework. Yeah. But I also internally, I'm 100% toxic. Like my internal experience of myself, that cake is baked. Like that's not.
It comes when you grow up. Like I've been like corresponding with a fellow Saturnalia person. I published two full-length books of Saturnalia books, and there's this poet there, Christopher Salerno, who talks about that. Like it's baked in.
Any relation, since we're talking about masculinity?
Oh, to
Oh
bring it
no,
back,
that's not, it wasn't Salerno. It was what was her name? Valerie,
Valerie.
the scum woman.
Oh,
Society
Valerie Solano. Valerie
Solano.
Solano.
Never mind. Okay, so
The
that's what
one
I'm
who
thinking of. Yeah, yeah,
shot Warhol in the gut and he had to wear that
yeah,
fucking like,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, like
yeah,
thing that
yeah.
held basically held in his insides.
Yeah. Yeah, the Society for Cutting Up Men, and there were
Yes.
I saw the Scum Manifesto.
I remember reading that and just being sort of like stunned. I was an undergraduate. I was like 18, 19 years old. I
Sure,
didn't know how
yeah,
to
yeah,
process
yeah,
it. I was in like a women's studies course and it was just sort of like, and I was a dick in that women's studies course. I
yeah,
remember
yeah,
it
yeah.
now. Like I was the example of the things that I'm talking about now and sort of like wagging my finger at.
I mean, you also were taking a women's studies course, so I don't know.
Agreed. Well, I went to a
Yeah.
university where it was required. There was,
Oh, okay,
I
all right.
think it was
You
even a
get no
women's
credit then.
fair. I mean, I should get very little credit. It wasn't terribly well taught, to be perfectly
Yeah,
honest, but it was also like I was like one of two guys who was not making the room any better and not
yeah, yeah.
learning to the extent that I could have.
I knew one male women's studies major in college, and he was a prick. He was the worst.
Oh, because he's just like lording it over everybody. Like, hey, look,
Yeah,
man.
he
Like,
was. I mean, he was also. It felt like there was a very straight line for him between majoring in women's studies and getting skirt.
it
It
was a
was very
pull
much a means to an end. It seemed,
I see.
but also but lording it over cavemen like me was definitely a bonus.
As it always is, right?
Yeah,
Lording
yeah,
it
yeah.
over is one of the things we do best as humans.
So a little while ago, Alice Allen, who does the Poetry Says and is also on SLEERICKETS a lot, she did an Ask Me Anything episode, and I sent her a bunch of obnoxious questions, and she was generous enough to answer them in delightful ways. She also did a great roast of SLEERICKETS on there, which is worth listening to. But one of my questions to her was, "How should a man be?"
Mm.
And I kind of expected her to say, like, well, men should be any way they want to be, and who's to say? But I was actually really pleased that she like shot from the hip and gave like a very straightforward prescriptive answer that I it clearly can't apply to all men, but I thought like it both felt like it felt understandable, and like I was sympathetic as an endorsement, and it felt like it maybe it picked up something of a, if not a masculine essence, then like it didn't seem like they were just generic values. It didn't seem like it was just a list of unisex virtues. It did seem as if there was something satisfyingly masculine about it. But I want to see if I can play this little clip. If I can't, I can read it. But I think if I do it this way, it should work. Okay, great. All right. So this is, I'm going to have to trim it a little bit, but this is Alice telling us how a man should be.
Okay. Question number one. I was trying to answer this seriously. I don't know if it was coming across, but Matthew wants to know, how should a man be? Ditto a woman if you have time. I'm not going to take very long with this at all. A man should be exactly like Agent Cooper in season 1 of Twin Peaks. Confident without being overbearing, in touch with his intuition, smart, but also open-minded, and got great boundaries. There it is. It's all there. It's all there for anyone to watch.
So she goes on and has a good line about some other things. She's just delightful in general. I'm going to try to plug this back in. I should confess, I've never seen Twin Peaks. It makes me feel like I should now. You haven't either?
No, I mean, I assume it's the character played by
the mayor of Portland, Kyle MacLachlan.
That's right, Kyle MacLachlan. Yeah, and those Portlandia shows, which I have strong feelings about.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it helps that he's like super handsome and like,
Yeah, it does seem like there's something you point out that I think I was impressed by and sort of touched by, is that you give Bly a lot of deserved grief for some of his talk about how men should be and what men are. It also seems like he gets real confused about his whole warrior thing because he wants it to be both literal and metaphorical at the same time somehow.
Yeah, the metaphor I heard about through one of my colleagues at Wabash. So like Bly visited Wabash, appropriately so, right? Like this mythopoetic men's movement
Got to.
maybe the 90s or so. And I wasn't there, But my colleague Warren Rosenberg was there, and Warren had lots of things to say about Bly. Warren had spent some time really studying masculinity and knew the work of Michael Kaufman and Michael Kimmel, who have like the best line about Bly ever, which is like, we don't need more iron Johns, we need more ironing Johns. Like, of course I had to like work that into the piece because it was so spot on. But when Warren Rosenberg heard Bly speak at Wabash, he was already in like the Q&A section to like raise his hand and like criticize him. And then he found himself at the end of the performance, I think, like actually in tears and quite moved.
Yeah.
And some of it, and he was the one who let me know that like this warrior thing was sort of more metaphoric in Bly's mind, and there was like some more ambiguity in there than maybe initially had seemed to be the case.
But then he also says a man who cannot defend his space cannot defend his wife and child. And he like I thought like a couple things, like one, like, well, that's not a metaphor, and two, I don't know, I saw him read, it was probably only 10 years after Iron John, and he was like an elderly Willy Wonka. I was like, you've never defended a space in your life, motherfucker. Like, I don't know, but you give him deserved grief, but then you say that there is something he gets right, and he gets right not just about poetry, but about masculinity, which is that initiation is important.
Yes. That's something that I experienced both in a personal level and then in my, again, like very sort of brief and not expert research in this, I saw in the literature on masculinity, right? That this sort of like father of masculinity studies, Michael Kimmel, writes in this book, Healing from the Heart, that most of the people who join hate groups, young men who join hate groups, almost all of them were abandoned by their fathers. So there is this seems like sort of understandable. There is this desire, right? Like it's a biological desire to sort of have a figure, a father figure, or I don't want to necessarily even say a father figure, right? Like I, have one of my son's close friends being raised by two women, but right, like to have a figure, to have somebody to help you into the world, to initiate you into the world is necessary. And like for me as a poet, like as a young poet, like an 18 to 22-year-old poet as an undergraduate, I was incredibly valuable to have somebody like that. I was at Denison University, and I don't name him in the piece, but he's since retired, and I have named him in many of other places. The poet's name was David Baker.
Who edits Kenyon? Is that right?
Yeah. He's just retired from the Kenyon Review and just retired from his teaching job. But we've become like friends and sort of long-term sort of like poetry. Just know each other. He was that kind of figure for me because I didn't really know what a man would look like in the poetry world. Like obviously I'd read all these people in like anthologies, like, oh, there's Byron, there's Keats or whatever. But what does it look like to have a real living human being who's writing poetry and as a man? And for me, like as a hetero cisgendered white guy, like going into the world, that was really valuable because I was under that sort of impression that like poetry was a sort of feminized, sissy art form.
Right.
And I needed some sort of person to help me through that. It's not like we were having like, heart to heart, conversations in his office hours, but just having the example there, like as the leader of workshops and things like that. And as I write in the piece, like when I got to my MFA at the University of Michigan, I was the only guy in this cohort. Like that wasn't a problem. Like it didn't sort of like, I didn't feel emasculated or anything.
But I do want, like, I think you get at something about initiation. And I never really had like an artistic master in that sense, which is something I've complained about to other poet friends of mine, that it felt like something was missing. But it seems like most of the positive, praiseworthy examples of masculine initiation that come up these days are really, again, defined negatively rather than positive. That like, well, for example, being male doesn't mean you can't write poetry, or being masculine doesn't mean you can't iron clothes, or being like, it doesn't mean you can't do this, or it doesn't, it's okay to do this thing, rather than being male means X. And I think where I'm with you in finding like alarming a lot of the sort of extremist initiation that comes from the far right, that comes from weird, curdled online groups, that comes from Islamic fundamentalism in some cases, not fundamentalism, but jihadism in some cases. It comes from all sorts of, gang culture. It comes from a lot of different places. That is actively bad, but it does seem like an advantage it has over, super enlightened progressive masculinity is it has a positive answer to the question, what does it mean? What should I, how should I be? If I'm a young man, what is it I should, what is it I'm being initiated into? Is it just defined negatively? Is it just, you can wear a dress or you can wear overalls, or is it something positive?
Yeah. So I'm going to sort of paraphrase this because it helps me sort of like get at what you're saying. Cause it's a really interesting point that like on the sort of like enlightened masculine role model sort of world, it just opens up to a bunch of possibilities, and it isn't quite as easy to sort of like, provide X. This is what you're going to do. This is what you're supposed to be. This is what your role is. Yeah, that does make it harder. And a kind of an intellectually more challenging feat, or emotionally, psychologically more challenging feat for the young man under that sort of model, under that sort of tutelage, to sort of find his place in the world. But I think in a way that's exactly what we want, that like there is a more expansive or flexible series of options in terms of how you can be a man. That all those other models that you're showing have some version of a sort of narrow channel that is going to involve sort of like bro culture, suppressing your emotions, violence, being afraid of like therapy. And that's not giving us really great results, right? Like
how do you, because I know my sister-in-law and my wife have used this term broadly, and Alice has occasionally, and I always feel a little bit, it's like I kind of know, I know the smell of what you're talking about, but I don't know the denotation. What is bro culture?
Gosh, it's funny. I was just on a immersion trip to Greece with a colleague of mine in classics, and she just taught a class at Wabash. So she just taught a class on Greek religion at Wabash, and there was an immersion component in Greece for 10 days, 15-week class, 10 days in Greece. So she takes all these guys to Greece. She's the female leader of the class. I join her doing some like poetry, creative writing exercises, doing some stuff on Greek statuary. And I was describing this because I saw little elements of it with the guys, and they were like on the sort of light end. Like I think a lot of our Wabash guys are just sort of all have a sort of bro-y element to it. So this is a roundabout way of saying a sort of like cliquish inability to sort of maybe focus on things, a desire to just kind of crack each other up. This is all very sort of like light bro-y culture, a desire to make everybody around you in your little masculine subset laugh at what you say and sort of be like in that sort of world, as opposed to in this instance where they're on a sort of like, scholastic excursion to a foreign country, like slotting yourself into the sort of like professional role that you are as a student. That's, and you're right. Like I could already feel your sort of like objection. Right. Like, well, they're just being like dudes, or like,
but also like in an odd way, like you've identified something that does seem like positively masculine and maybe not a terrible thing, which is the desire to make your friends laugh. Like that, like it's not that women don't do that. It's not that anybody can't do that. It's just that like that. You're right. That tendency to like joke and one up and crack up your friends is something that I associate with men, and is often is a way to communicate. Like what can be difficult among men is like not having the right script. Like if you don't have an activity, if you don't have a task or a challenge or a game, it can be difficult to know how to communicate. And so cracking each other up can be a great script for that.
Yeah. And I think in this case, it was because they were doing it at moments when they should have been, and this didn't happen a ton, but it happened enough that, so we sort of noticed it. They were doing it at moments when they should be focused at other things. Sure.
Yeah. Or they were doing it in a way that was showing disrespect to somebody else. Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, I think, and as I was saying, like it's like a sort of a light version of that. Like, I think the other version is kind of like, or like not the other version, but like the darker version is kind of like locker room sort of like talk, right? Like, or like locker room sort of misogyny, right? Like the things that men will say when they're among other men that are inherently disparaging to women, and they feel sort of like okay with that because they're surrounded by other guys. And, right, like the Trump example comes to mind, but that's even further down the sort of spectrum of like awfulness, right? Grab him by the pussy. And he described that as, that's just locker room talk. Like I would say that like that's the extreme version of like a kind of bro culture, that I'm willing to say this stuff because I'm within a kind of like cadre of men, and no one in that group is going to call out that particular behavior, even if it's sort of awful, because they don't want to be ostracized. So it's like reinforcing among that sort of group of guys. I don't know. I hope that sort of starts to answer it. I feel like I went about it roundabout.
It does. I think that you're right that there's certainly a tendency that can arise among men. And I didn't go to an all boys school, but I went to summer camp and I played a shit ton of sports and was never very good at talking to girls. I spent a lot of time around guys. So there is a tendency to want to go along with what's being said and go with the flow. That I don't know if that's specifically masculine. I feel like that may be human, because it certainly seems like that happens in lots of other contexts that are not, they're not masculine or not even, unisex. The thing I always thought about locker room talk is like, because I heard two things when that tape came out where Trump said they let you grab them by the pussy when you're a star.
Which was like just basically repeated with the E. Jean Carroll trial, that it's like, when his deposition came to light. Yeah.
The two things I tended to hear were, oh, that's just boys being boys. Or on the other end, I have never heard someone speak this way in a locker room.
Which is bullshit.
Which is also bullshit. The thing I thought was like, I have heard people speak that way in a locker, but as a joke. And the difference with locker room talk in the past is that certainly I've heard some awful things in locker. Certainly I've heard some like racist things or sex. Like certainly I've heard some like actually horrible things. What I have more often heard is off-color jokes that people know are bad, but they feel free to, because they realize that people in the room will realize it's a joke. And so it's not that that's not part of a slippery slope. It's not that, but like I have heard people say things like that Trump remark in quotation marks as the thing that some fucking idiot would say, but it's funny in some context, right? Like that's the way I've heard that before.
The kind of thing that you might hear like when you're at like a dinner party, like, well, maybe that's not the right example because that usually implies couples and multi-gym. Yeah. No, I hear that. Yeah.
And I feel like is that.
So how much should we be critical of that, right? Like,
I can't imagine
let that go.
Yeah, like I can't imagine that among women there's not shitty talk about men. It's among like among almost any in group there's shitty talk about out groups, and some of that. I mean, I think some of that is some of that natural or inevitable.
I think some of it is natural and inevitable. I mean, I think the question that will always be raised when like, for instance, you bring up like, well, what's happening in the women's locker room, or isn't there some in-group, jokes at men's expense and other, sort of closed sort of conversation. Is that, of course, men are in like the position of power, right? And it sort of reinforces a series of behaviors and comments that might then leave the locker room that like it's a kind of it's not equal, right? Like it wouldn't be equal necessarily. But I mean, I do hear that, right? That sort of like contextualization that people are doing this sometimes in quotes. They're sort of miming or sort of maybe even mocking the thing while saying it. It gets, I mean, it's like the question of irony, right? Like how it's not like that somebody's going to hear it as non-ironic. I guess that's my thing that always makes me worried is like, because I see it with our guys at Wabash, and I know that some of them are bright enough to make that joke, and they're making the joke as a joke, and they're doing it in air quotes, and they're like maybe a junior or senior, and then there's a freshman in that group who I'm watching his eyes, and he's trying to follow this, and I'm like, does he get that this is a joke, or is this just like what it's just like. And that's like the thing that like within that bro culture, like that does make me sort of nervous. And I don't know, like I as a professor, I don't always want to insert myself into it. But I feel sometimes that I have the ability to insert myself into it as a guy on faculty.
Yeah.
Whereas my female colleagues don't. Like, and that always makes me sort of really almost like a little guilty that like so I'm unwinding a little bit here, but like when we have conversations about gender in my classroom, one of the benefits of having an all male classroom is that the guys will say some of that shit that's a little locker roomy, or maybe even like directly that they wouldn't say necessarily in a co-ed classroom.
Right. And but then you can address it. You can talk about it.
Bingo, right? Like that it creates the opportunities for dialogue as long as you take it slowly, right? Like that's one of the things I bring up in the Emily Dickinson piece about teaching Emily Dickinson to men, right? The truth must dazzle gradually or every man be blind.
Right.
When I wrote that piece, I realized that's been kind of my mantra for teaching men about masculinity and feminism at an all-male college. Anyway, I'm sort of spinning, but like my female colleagues don't have that because they're always coded when they enter the room as being other. Sure. And I can turn on because I did sports a little bit, like I played baseball. I could start to like mention shit about like the Detroit Tigers or whatever. And I'm like, I can just do enough to like get some sense, particularly over the course of a semester, some sense of like fellow male feeling.
Yeah.
And that's why usually when I like in a class is not entirely about Dickinson, like I'll have them read an Atlantic piece about masculinity late in the semester after I built a rapport with them. And then, and I have a colleague who teaches a class on fatherhood where he's got this, like, he's much better at this than I am. His name's Eric Olafson. He like waits till late in the semester and eventually like sort of brings up this point to them, like, you know, do you guys understand why you can finally sort of like think about yourselves as like fathers and staying at home and doing this thing? And he's like, the reason for that? And they're like, why? And he's like, feminism, right? Like it provided this opportunity for you to sort of think about masculinity differently.
That was this week's show. Thank you all so much for listening. Look in the show notes. You can find links to all of Derek's stuff. And check out At Length at, I believe it's atlength.com. Nope. All right, the URL for At Length is atlengthmag.com. So check it out now. It is currently edited by friend of the show, Jonathan Farmer, and soon to be edited by also friend of the show, Derek Mong. You can reach me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.